This video literally has it all. Authentication, databases, files, storage, uploads, permissions, Firebase, React, literally anything you can think of, this project is going to cover it because we're going to create a full Google Drive clone. And this is going to be a long video, so I hope you have some snacks, food, a drink, something to entertain you because this is going to be a long one. Let's get started now. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. So if that sounds interesting, subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this. Now really quickly, I just want to give a demo of what this entire project is going to encapsulate because it's pretty large. So to get started, this is just like the home screen of our application, the Google Drive application. You can see we have our folder structure up here as well as the folders we've created. So I can click on new folder and we can navigate into it, and you can see I can go back to the root, back to new folder. I can open up this child folder, and as you can see inside of here, I have different files that I've uploaded in this folder. So like image 1, I can click on it, and here it lets me download this image, and it opens it up in a new tab for me. So pretty straightforward stuff. If I go back to the root here, click on this folder, you can see that we have folders at the top here where the folders are, and then a line separating the separate files inside of here. We can create a new folder. We'll call this like new 2. And now we've created a new folder we can navigate inside of. And we can even upload an image inside of here. For example, let's upload this bridge image. We get a nice progress bar at the bottom as it uploads. And then as soon as that finishes, we see that our bridge image is uploaded right here. So there's a ton of functionality. But on top of that, we also can log out and log into a different user, which I've just called test2 at test.com. And once I log into this user, you can see that they have completely different folders. They just have this single folder with no files in it. So you're able to have different profiles with different folders, different structures, different files, and all of that. It's essentially Google Drive in a nutshell. Now this is an absolute ton to cover in one video, so I'm actually going to be taking the code from my React Firebase authentication video and using that as our starting point. So if you haven't already seen that video, I'm going to link it in the cards and description for you. But essentially, I'm using the exact code from that video as our starting point, which gives us the login and logout capabilities. If you don't really care about that, you can skip this section and just download the code. You don't have to watch the video, it's not required. But it is nice to be able to have that video in place so you can understand exactly what we're doing in this video. So I highly recommend you watch this React Firebase auth video, which again will be linked in the cards and description of this video. Once you've completed that, you should have this source code, which will again be linked in the description for you to download, and that's going to be our starting point. Also, we created a Firebase project in that video. All we did in that Firebase project was essentially do authentication. So all I've done is rename this project to Google Drive Demo. That way we have a better name. And I've just deleted all of the current users we had. So all the test users are gone. So we have a completely blank slate to start with this project that's already hooked up to our application. So now with all of that said, let's just start up our application and see exactly what we have to start with. We can just run npm start. That's going to start up our application, open it up on the side here for us. Here we go. I'll just drag this over to the side. This is the current version of our application that's loading up. And then over here on the left, we have the final working version of our project, so we can kind of compare and contrast a little bit. So now that that loaded up, you can see we're on the login page. Let's just sign up with a user. We'll just call them test at test.com. Give them a generic password. And we can sign them up, and you can see we get directed to the profile. We can update the profile if we want, but other than that, we don't have any functionality built into this other than the profile and the logout functionality. And what we're going to be doing in this video is adding all of that additional Google Drive functionality on top of it. And that main Google Drive functionality is if we log into a user here, test at test.com, password, we can log in, and you can see this is the functionality we're going to be adding. So to first do that, we need to make a few modifications to our existing code, because right now, if we look inside of our source folder here, go to our components, and if we go to our app, you can see we wrap our entire app in this container, and this container is giving us this look where all of our stuff is centered in the center of our screen. Like if I zoom out, you can see it's in the dead center of our screen. We don't necessarily want that on our Google Drive page. We only want that on our profile related pages. I'm going to take all of our authentication and profile pages and move them in their own folder inside of components. We're just going to call this authentication. And essentially I want to move all of this code related to authentication into there, not the dashboard, so just this code for authentication into this folder. Once that's done, let me just save all these files that we moved, so that way they show up as being changed. If we refresh, hopefully this will work, not quite. But if we go to our app, you can see we just need to update our routes here. Right now we're importing here from private route. We need to pull from authentication/private route. We need to do that for all of our different routes. So let me just copy this over for all of our different routes that we moved. That should be all of them. And if we save, refresh over here, looks like we're missing our sign up page. So if I just come up here, paste it for our sign up page as well, Now there we go, that is all of our pages correctly hooked up. So essentially all we've done is move some files into this authentication folder, nothing real big. Now the next thing I want to do is take this container we wrap our router in and instead put it on each one of our individual routes that we have here. So I'm just going to kind of copy this code and create a new file in here called centered container.js. Use that RFC trick in order to just automatically generate this for us. And inside this centered container, I just want to paste that code that we copied. Make sure we close off this div and close off the container, just like that. And then we need to, of course, import container, and that's coming from React Bootstrap. There we go. And then inside of here, all we want to do is just print out some children. Essentially, we're going to be passing some elements into this, our children, and we just want to render them with this container wrapping around them. So we're going to take in the children. So essentially the way this works, if we were to replace this code, we could replace all of this with that centered container class, or that centered container component, and down here do the exact same thing. Now this is going to be exactly the same. If we save, you'll notice no differences in our output, because all we've done is encapsulated that code inside of its own component. But we don't want this inside of our app. We instead want this on each one of our elements. So here we would do our centered container instead of this fragment. And down here, same exact thing, centered container. And in our app, we would remove this centered container because we want that to be only for individual elements related to authentication. So if we just go through each one of these, replace this fragment with our centered container, we should hopefully just move that code inside of each one of these individual components. This private right doesn't really worry about it, but sign up down here, we want this to be centered. Let's do that and make sure that we import up here centered container from, and that's going to come from /centered container. And lastly, do the exact same thing on our update. Oh, it's already done here. Our update, sorry. There we go. We want centered container and centered container. And finally, make sure that we import that. So we'll say import centered container from /centered container. So that should hopefully center everything except for our profile page, because that's right now encapsulated in this dashboard component. And since our dashboard is going to be essentially completely different, this is our new dashboard. We want to take this dashboard component. We're just going to rename it to profile.js, change this to be profile.js, and we're just going to move this up into authentication. Then in our app here, wherever we're importing our dashboard, which is right here, we're going to import profile instead, and that's coming from authentication/profile. Then down here, we're just going to change our dashboard to our profile. If we save, we're of course getting some errors because we need to save this file first. So if we save that, you'll notice it's now here. We can now change this to our centered container, just like this, and hopefully that should center itself. There we go. So now all of our different pages are being centered. If we log out, we have our login page centered, our sign up page is centered, and everything is already centered exactly as we want. Even our forgot password page is centered. So let's just log back in as that user. And now we're redirected to our dashboard, which in our case is our profile. Now, as I mentioned, we don't really want our dashboard to be our profile. So inside of our routing here, I want to change our routing so that we don't have this dashboard route anymore. And instead we have a /user route. And if we do that, we don't need this to be exact anymore. And this can render our profile. And even to make this a little better, let's just add some comments. All of these routes down here are for authentication. These are for our profile or our user. And then up here, we're going to have our Google Drive clone routes. Right now, we don't have any of these routes. That's perfectly okay. So we have our profile routes and our auth routes. Now what we need to do is make sure we redirect to /user whenever we update our profile. So inside of update profile, right here, let's just find it. Right here, we're redirecting to our old dashboard. This should be user now instead, because it should be pushing to our user. So now if we just go to /user, you can see if we update our profile and if we click cancel, for example, we get brought back here. So already that's a mistake. Where our cancel button is, should be, /user. Make sure we go to /user. So if we click update profile and we will click update, for example, we get directed here. Or if we click cancel, we get directed back to this profile page, which is great. And when we log in, you can see we get directed to our dashboard, which currently doesn't do anything. That's fine because when we log in, we obviously want to get brought to the dashboard. So now we can finally work on actually new code instead of modifying this old existing code to work with our new project. So the very first thing I want to do is I'll just create a new folder where all of our Google Drive related files are going to go. And we'll just call it Google Drive. And in here, I'm going to create a new file, which is going to be our new dashboard.js. So if we just generate this dashboard here real quick, you can see we have our dashboard. And inside of here, the first thing I want to work on rendering out is this nav bar at the very top, because this is actually a pretty straightforward and simple thing to make, and it'll allow us to get access to this profile page, which has a back button to bring us back to our dashboard. So to do that, I'm actually going to create another separate component for our nav bar. So we'll just say navbar.js, and inside of here, we're just going to RFC our navbar. And this navbar, we actually can't call navbar. We technically can, but if we want to import and use the navbar from Bootstrap, it's also called navbar, and we could rename it to, something like Bootstrap navbar like this, and then we don't have to worry about these conflicts. But instead, I'm just going to call this navbar component, and that's going to get rid of all these issues. So we can just use the normal default navbar name. We also need to get our nav for navigation, like I said, from React Bootstrap. This just avoids the conflict by renaming this. Now here, I want to use our navbar component instead of this default div. I want to use a light themed navbar, so I'm going to say our background is going to be light, and I want this to be expanded all the way up until the small screen sizes. Essentially, I don't want this to ever drop down to be a smaller navbar that has the triple dots where it expands, because we only have one button. We don't need to worry about that toggle ability. So next thing I want to work on here is our navbar .brand. This is going to be like the big font that you see on the left-hand side here for WDS Drive. And all I want to do inside of here is put the text WDS Drive. And I want to make this a link that goes back to the home page. If we click on it, you can see here we get redirected back to our root folder. So to do that, we can say we want to make this a link. This is a React Router link. So we can import that link from React Router. We want to get the React Router DOM. I also need to say where we're going to, which is just the root folder, just like that. Now the next thing I need to do is actually create our nav, and in here, I'm going to have a link, and this link will be for our profile. So we're going to say that it's going to be a React Router link. That's what the as is for. This is going to go to the /user page. And inside this link, we'll just put the text profile. Now if we save this and import it into our dashboard, so we can say here, we have a nav bar, and this navbar is coming from our navbar component. We're just going to shorten the name down to navbar so it's easier to use, just like this. Now we're actually rendering out that navbar, and we can save, go over here, refresh our page, and you'll notice nothing actually shows up. The reason for this is because in our app, we're not actually handling this route. We need to handle a private route because we want only logged in users to access this. That is going to be the exact path of our dashboard, and the component will be that dashboard component, and that's automatically imported for us. And then we just need to make sure we import dashboard from ./Google Drive /dashboard. There we go. Close this off, click save, and now our dashboard is being rendered just like we want. There is one slight difference though, in that our profile is not showing up on the right hand side, and that's because this should say expand instead of expanded, and that is going to expand out to make it fill the entire width just like we want, just like this. Now also inside of our dashboard, we want to be able to render more than just our navbar, so we're going to wrap this inside of here, the fragment tags. We can just make our navbar self-closing because it doesn't really matter, there's nothing inside of our navbar. And the next thing I want to render out is a container, which we're getting from React Bootstrap up here. But I want this to be a fluid container so it takes up the full width of our screen. And this is where all of our content is going to go inside of here. So if we save, you can see we have our content and it's filling the entire width. If it had more text, it would go all the way to the right side of our screen instead of being scrunched down only in the center of our screen like a normal container would do. So now we need to really think about what the next logical step is now that we have our dashboard set up. And if we go over to our current working example, you can see that we have our breadcrumbs right here. We have an add file button, an add folder button, the view of our folders, as well as the view of all of our different files. And since in our current application, we don't have any data saved, so we have no folders and no files, it really doesn't make sense to work on displaying out our files, displaying out our folders, or displaying out our breadcrumbs. It makes more sense to work on these buttons for adding a file or adding a folder. And out of those two, you need a folder to add a file to, so we're going to work on adding our folder first. So we're going to work on this add folder button first, and then from there we're going to work on everything else. So to do that, let's create a separate component for that button. This will make sure that our code is abstract as possible and in small little components instead of being one massive component. We'll call this an add folder button. And again, we'll use that nice RFC trick to generate out our add folder button. Now in our current example, the way this works is pretty simple. We click the button and it opens up a modal with a simple form with a close and an add button for creating that new folder. So we want our button to do that exact same thing. So the first thing I want to do is make this a button, and I want it to have an on click that is just going to run a function we'll call open modal, and that's going to open up a random modal for us. And instead of using the actual button here, we're going to use the Bootstrap button. So let's make sure we import button from, React Bootstrap, just like that. Copy this down, and our variant here is going to be equal to outline success, and we want this to have a size here of small. So if we save this and make sure we actually render this button, we'll put a little bit of text in it just for now. In our dashboard, we're going to render out that button inside of our container. We're going to say add folder button, just close that off, click save, and you can see open modal is not defined. So in here, we're just going to define a function called open modal. For now, it's going to do nothing because we don't have that code yet. So now if we save, you can see we have our button and it looks just like we want. Now the next thing we need to do once we have this button is actually add in these little folder and file icons. And we're going to be using Font Awesome for that because they have tons of different icons, super easy to use, and they have a great React interface. So if we go to just fontawesome.com, look for the React interface, you can see this command right here we can run to download the 3 libraries we're going to need. So I'm going to do exactly that. I'm going to run these 3 different commands to download the 3 different libraries we need for Font Awesome. This is going to give us all of the free icons we can use, the React interface, as well as just the default core library that kind of glues everything together. And once that's done downloading, we can kind of just close out of this. You can use this to search for the different icons that you need, but I already know what icons we're going to be using, so we don't really have to worry about searching for each one individually. All we need to do is make sure we import the different sections we're going to use. So the first thing that we need to import is going to be our Font Awesome icon. This is essentially the way it interacts with Bootstrap. And we're getting that from @FortAwesome, and we want to get that from the React Font Awesome right here. Then the next thing we need is our individual icons. We want the folder with a plus in it. We're going to use the FA folder plus icon. And that is again going to come here from @FortAwesome. And this is from the free solid SVG icon set, just like that. Once we have both of these done, we can actually render that icon. So we can say we want to have the Font Awesome icon, and the actual icon itself is going to be that FA folder plus icon. Close that off. And if we save, we should get that folder icon showing up. And as you can see, we get that plus folder icon exactly where we want it. So now with that button in place, the next thing to work on is our modal. We're going to need state for that. So we're just going to have a state of whether it's open, and we can do set open here. That'll just be use state. By default, we want the modal to be closed, obviously. And we of course need to get use state from React. So we can say we're going to input use state from React, just like that. Now that we have the state, inside of our open modal, we can just set open to true. We can create a function for closing our modal. And in here, we're just going to set open to false. That's just 2 nice handy helper functions for opening and closing our modal. With that done, we can go down and actually create our modal. So to do this, let's again use fragments because we're going to have 2 different things inside of here. So if we have a fragment, we can now put in our modal. And inside of this modal, we need all of our modal code. And of course, we need to import our modal from React Bootstrap. Now in this modal, we want the show to be only when open is true. And we want onHide to actually close our modal. So let's make sure we just set both of those up. Inside of our modal, let's just put a little bit of random text to see if this works. If we click on this button, we get a modal popping up with that text. And if we click somewhere else, it'll close out of our modal using this onHide function. So now let's actually create the modal itself. To do that, I'm just going to use a simple form. And in this form, we're going to have our body of our modal. So we'll have modal.body. And we're also going to have a footer, which is going to contain all the buttons for our modal. So we'll say modal.footer, just like that, and make sure I spell footer properly. There we go. Let's make sure we input our form up here so we can use that form component from Bootstrap. Now inside of our body, it's pretty straightforward. We just need to input the name of our folder. So we're going to create a form.group. And this form group is just going to be a label. So form.label, and it's going to be a form control. So we're going to have form.control, and this is going to just be self-closing like that. So our label is simply going to say name, and we'll just say folder name to be extra clear what it is. And for our control, we just need to have a bunch of different inputs. For example, we know that this is going to be a text input. We want this to be a required field because we can't create a folder with no name. Our value, our value here, we're going to set to a variable called name. And then when we change this, we're going to change that name variable, which is again just state. So we'll say set name, and our name is e.target, set name, e.target.value. We can create that name up here, very similar to how we created our open variable. And by default, we just want this to be an empty string. So there's our two pieces of state. And right here, we're modifying that name when we type into it. So if this works, we should be able to open up our modal, type in a name, and that's updating our name variable for us right here. So that all looks like it's working. Now inside of our footer, let's create our buttons. So we're going to have a button here, and this is going to be for closing our modal. So we're going to give this a variant of secondary, just like that. And on click, we want this to close our modal. So we'll say close modal. Close that off. Now we can create a separate button. But first, we should probably put some text inside of here, which says close, and then we'll close off that button. There we go. Now our next button here is going to be very similar, but this one's going to be for adding our folder. It's like our submit button. So we want this one to have a variant of success. So we can say that this is going to be for submitting our form, and also a type of submit, so we know that this submits our form. So now we click on this, we can type in our name, click close to close it, or we can click add folder, and that's actually going to submit the page. Right now, we want that to actually go in behind the scenes, go to our Firebase and create a record in our database instead of just refreshing the page. So to do that, we need to handle our on submit for our form. For the function, we'll just call handle submit. And let's create that up here. Function handle submit. And inside of here, let's just make sure we take in our event and do e.prevent default. Now inside of here, essentially what we need to do is create a folder in the database. That's what we're going to be using Firebase for. And then what we also need to do is just set our name back to an empty string. So if we reopen our modal, it'll be there with an empty string. And we need to close out of our modal because we obviously don't need it to be open after we submit our form. So now, if we do this, everything will work except for actually creating it in the database. We can type in a name, hit add folder, and you can see we can reopen this and it's going to be completely cleared out for us. So that's all working. The only step left is obviously the most difficult part of connecting this with Firebase. Now, in order to access Firebase, we have this firebase.js, which right now exports our authentication. We could come in here and just say export const firestore equals app.firestore, and that's going to give us access to all of our database related stuff. But this is a lot of information to give the user. So instead of exporting this Firestore, what I want to do is actually export just part of it. We're going to export a variable called database, which is going to be a slightly dumbed down version of our whole Firestore object. For example, if we want to access our folders of our database, that'd be our firestore.collection. We want to get the collection that contains our folders. That's what we're going to call our collection of all the folders. So now we can't access everything related to Firestore, just our individual folders. And since we know in the future we're going to have files, we could create a object on our property on our object called files, and that can access the files collection inside of our database. That's going to be really useful for just making it easier to work with our database as a whole. So now in our add folder button, I could come up here and I could say import database. Database. I could import that from // and I want to get that from, again, going back one more level, and we can go to Firebase just like that. Now we have access to that database. And as we can see here, app.firestore is not a function, and that's because we haven't imported it up here. So let's make sure we import Firestore. Now hopefully that error should go away if I just refresh the page. Let it load for a second, and there we go, the error is gone. So now we have access inside of here to our database. We can go and say database.folders.add. This is going to allow us to add a new folder based on the object we pass to it. So we could say name, for example, is our name. Now we've created a new folder with that name. So in order to test that this works, let's just create a folder. We can just come in here. We can say test folder, hit add folder. Everything appears to have worked. No errors happened. So if we go over to our Google Drive demo and we come over here to our Cloud Firestore section, we click, we should see if we create a database and just make sure we say we're going to start in test mode so we have access to everything, hit next, and in here, we just want to say our cloud location, that's fine, US Central, click enable, and now we've created our Firestore. What we did before technically didn't even work because we didn't have a database created yet, but now if we come in here and we try to create a test folder and click add folder, now if we refresh this, we should hopefully have a collection called folders. There we do. And inside of our collection, we have both of our test folders. So it looks like it actually did create our folder, even though our database didn't even exist yet. Either way, though, we now have a test folder created. We technically have two because we created it twice. We can come in here, create something else, new test folder. Oops, new test folder. Hit add folder. Come over here, and we should hopefully see if we just do a quick refresh that we now have another object in here called new test folder with that name and our two old test folders just like before. So right now we were able to create these folders with names, but it's not super secure. Anyone can create a folder, anyone can access a folder. We don't know who the parent of this folder is, we don't know what's in the folder. Really, we don't know anything about this. We want to save some additional information. One thing that would be really nice to know is what is the ID of the parent folder? So we kind of want to save a parent ID. We also want to save who created the folder, so like the user ID would be really useful. It'd also be useful to have like a path of the parents of the folder, so that's something that would be useful to have. And then finally, it'd be really useful to know when these folders were created. So like a created at timestamp would also be really useful. Right now, we only have access to the name. The user ID is luckily really easy to get because we have this context with all of our auth information. So in here, we can just import use auth. We want to get that from our // context. Whoops, one more step back. Then we can get the context, and we want to get our auth context. And in here, we can just say current user is equal to use auth. And that is a function. Now we can take our current user all the way down here. We can just say current user.id is our user ID. And actually this should be UID, just like that. So let's just comment out all these other lines real quick. Comment out the path, comment out the created at. And now if we save this, we should hopefully when we create a folder have our user ID saved there as well. So let's just clear out this collection real quick, just so we don't have any of those old pieces of data lying around. And now let's create a new one. Let's refresh this, see if it's still working. Looks like I had an error up here. Accidentally put a parenthesis right there. Refresh this. There we go. Add a folder. Call this one test. Click add. And now inside of here, if we refresh, we should have a folders collection. And inside of here, we have a test. And the user ID is the user ID of the current user we're using. So now we can actually distinguish who the user is that created the folder and only show users folders that they themselves have created or that they are working on or that they're editing. Now, the next thing that's really easy is actually this created at timestamp. This is something we can get from Firebase itself because we could pass up our own timestamp, but Firebase has a really unique way of being able to create a timestamp when the data actually gets to the server where it's saving it at our database. To do this, let's just create another function in here called get current timestamp. And that's just going to be equal to firebase.firestore.fieldValue.server timestamp. Essentially, this is a function that we can run, and it's going to create a value that is going to be the server timestamp at that point. So right here, our get current timestamp is going to be this function that allows us to create a timestamp for the server. So inside of here, we can set our created at here to database.getCurrentTimestamp, and that's a function. So now if we save this, and let's just create a brand new one, we'll call this, test2. Create that, come over here, refresh, and we should hopefully have another value for our test2 right here, and it has a created at, which is the current time that I'm recording this, January 19th. That's pretty straightforward. Now the next two things, our parent ID and path, are both going to be linked to each other because we need to have access to whatever the current folder we're inside of is. And right now our application doesn't have any idea of current folder or anything to do with folders at all, really. So inside of our add folder button, we need to pass it the current folder, and this current folder is going to allow us to do the parent ID because that's clearly just our current folder.id because we're creating a new folder inside of the folder we're currently inside of. Path is something we're going to come back to in a little bit, so don't really worry about that. The only other thing we need to do is set up a simple little check here that says if current folder is equal to null, just return, because we can't create a folder if we're not already in some type of folder, whether that's our root folder or like this, or if we're inside of a custom folder that we've created ourselves. Either way, we need a folder to be able to create a folder inside of it. So how are we going to go about accessing this current folder? We could do all of the logic inside of our dashboard here, but again, I want this to be more about presentation, and I want most of the logic to be separated out somewhere else. So I'm going to create a custom hook inside of a folder called hooks, and this custom hook is going to be all of the logic that we need for our actual folder itself. So we're going to call this use folder.js and make sure that this hooks folder is inside of our source. That's why it's right next to our context here. And we can have an export of a function called use folder. And inside of here is all of our use folder code. So inside this use folder, I essentially want to take in a folder ID. Oops, make sure I spelled folder correctly. And by default, this folder ID, I'm just going to set to null if they don't pass anything in. The main reason for that is that Firebase doesn't really work very well when you use undefined. It doesn't really like undefined. So if we have null as our folder ID by default, then it's going to work, while undefined will throw us a bunch of errors. That's why I'm just setting it to null by default here instead of using undefined. And now what I want to do inside of here is track all of the state related to our folder itself. And since it's going to be fairly complex, I'm going to use a reducer for this. And if you're not used to reducers, I have an entire tutorial on the use reducer hook. I'll link up in the cards and description down below. So essentially, I want to create a state and a dispatch, which allows us to modify our state. And it's going to be using reducer. So we'll say use reducer, just like that. And of course, I cannot spell use reducer. There we go. Make sure that we import use reducer. We'll say import use reducer. And we're going to get that from React, just like that. And inside of our use reducer, we first need to pass it a function, which is going to be our reducer. We'll define that up here. And then what we also need to do is pass it our default state. And our default state is going to contain our folder ID. It's going to contain our folder object, which we're also going to pass in here. And we'll default this to null as well. And then also we're going to have our child folders and our child files. And our child files, in our case, is just an empty array by default. And same with our folders, that's going to be an empty array because we don't have any data yet. This is going to be our default state. We have our folder ID, we have our actual folder itself, as well as our child folders and our child files. Right now, we're really only concerned about the folder ID and the folder itself. Now, the first thing that I want to do is whenever our folder ID or our folder itself changes, I want to actually reselect our folder, essentially reset all of our default state. So I can just come in here and I can just say use effect, make sure that we import use effect up here. And inside this use effect, I want to run this set of code. And I want this code to run every single time either our folder ID or our folder changes. This is going to dispatch an event over to our reducer up here, which is going to take in our state. In our case, this is our state. And then we also have our type and our payload that we're going to be passing in as our parameters. Our dispatch is going to pass in what our type is. And this type right here is going to come from something we're going to just create a variable called actions. Const actions is equal to, and our first action is going to be called select folder. This is happening anytime we select a folder. So here, if we click on a folder, we selected it. Click on a breadcrumb, we selected a folder. That's what select folder does. It essentially resets all the information to our use folder. And this is just going to have the string select folder. The reason we're using this object is it just makes it easier to make sure we don't have any typos. So actions.select folder. Then our payload is going to contain information for our folder ID as well as our folder itself. And essentially all we're doing is anytime this folder ID or folder changes, we're retelling our code to just reset itself. We want to reset back to this initial state here. So if we scroll all the way up into our reducer, we can put a switch statement that is going to switch on our type here. And in the case that we have actions.select folder, what we want to do inside of here is we want to return a brand new state object. And this state object has our folder ID equal to our payload.folder ID. Our folder is equal to our payload.folder. Our child folders or files are empty. And our child folders are also empty. We just reset all of our data to the same thing we had down here. Also, I'm just going to set up a default case down here where we just return our state itself. So it's just, if we use an action that doesn't exist, we're just going to return our default state. That is the bulk of our reducer for selecting a brand new folder. Now the next thing I want to do is what happens when we pass in just a folder ID but no folder. Because right now the reason for this folder is so that when we change pages over here, for example from our root to our new folder, we can pre-populate things like our breadcrumbs as well as the names of different things, and we don't have to wait for our folder to load. Because right now we're just navigating to a new page with the ID, and if we didn't have this folder object being passed along, all of this breadcrumb information would be hidden until our folder completely loaded itself. So this just gives us some information about the folder without giving us all of the information about the folder. What we need to do next, though, is make it so that when we have our folder ID, we can load all the information about our folder and get all of the details. This includes the child files as well as the child folders, and not just details like the name of the folder. So to do this, we just need another simple use effect. We can say use effect, and this use effect is only going to change when the folder ID changes, because this is just going to update this folder variable from our folder ID. And that's just any time that we pass a new folder ID to use folder. This happens a lot when we're changing to a different folder, a different page, or if we type in a URL manually, for example. So inside here, the first thing I want to check for is if we have a null folder ID. So if folder ID is equal to null, then that means that we aren't in a folder. We're in what you would call the root folder because we're on the dashboard of our page. We don't have a folder ID yet. Because as you can see, we have folder IDs in our URL, but on the root, we don't have a folder ID because the root folder is really a made-up thing. There is no root folder in our database. It's just something that we've created to allow us to add folders to this root folder. It's just the nothingness, essentially. So here, I want to return our dispatch because I want to exit out immediately. I don't want to do any other code. And in here, I'm going to have a different type, and this is just going to be for updating our folder. So we're going to call it exactly that, update folder. And this payload for this is just going to contain our folder object, which is going to be something we're going to call our root folder. We're going to create this variable in just a second. So first, we need our update folder action, which is going to update our folder. And inside of here, we need a case for our actions.update folder. And inside of here, all we want to do is return a new state object, which takes our current state and it updates our folder to be our payload.folder. All it does is update the folder portion of our state. Now let's come in here and create our root folder object. So our root folder is just an object that's going to look very similar to our folder inside of here. It's going to mimic our database, but it's going to be essentially a fake object, a fake folder. So this will have a name, which is root, just like that. It'll have an ID, which in our case is null because it doesn't actually have an ID in our database. And our path is just going to be an empty array because there's nothing before this. Our path kind of indicates things that come before, and right now our path is an empty array because there are no things before our root folder. It is the root of our application. So now we've actually created some system that can identify when we have no folder, and it'll save us as the root folder in our case. To actually test this, if we come down here and just return our state, and then we use this use folder hook up here, so we can just say, whoops, const state equals use folder. Make sure that we import use folder up here. And right now we're passing it nothing because we don't have an ID to worry about. So we're just going to pass in our state. Let's just see what this state looks like. We can log it out, come over here, inspect our page, not view source. Make sure we inspect our page. Go to the console and you can see we have an object. This object has empty child files, empty child folders, no folder ID right now because our root doesn't have a folder ID, and it has a folder object with a name of root. Our ID is null and our path is an empty array. That's exactly what we want. Our current folder is our root folder because we don't actually have an ID of a folder we're currently on. So this is exactly what we want. We can actually pass that folder to our add folder button. Let's just destructure this a little bit. We're going to get our folder out of here. We're going to pass that to our add folder button as the current folder equals our folder. Now we have access to that current folder itself inside of here, and we can hopefully see that our parent ID for our next folder we create is going to be populated as null because we don't actually have a folder. So if we pass in just a random name, come over here, we find that element, and you can see the parent ID is set to null, and that's because our root folder has a null ID. So now the next step is if we go back to our use folder, what happens if we actually have a folder ID? Well, what we want to do is we want to access our database, which we just make sure that we import up here. So we'll say import database from Firebase, and we want to make sure it's going back a little ways. It's one too far, Firebase, just like that. So now, way back down here, we can say database dot folders. We want to get a single document, which is going to be our folder ID. And we can just say .get to get that document. This actually returns to us a promise. So we can say .then, and it's going to pass in a document. We can say console.log out that doc. Also, if there's an error, we can say .catch. And inside of this .catch, this would be like if you try to access a folder you don't have the permission to access, one folder you didn't create, for example. What we want to do is just copy this exact code up here. We just want to set to the folder to the root folder. So if there's an error getting the current folder, we're just going to update to the root folder instead. So now we essentially have here a document that we're getting, and then down here we have our actual folder itself. So let's see if this works if we pass in an ID. I'm just going to copy an ID. This right here is our ID of our folder. So I just want to copy this ID. It'll be a little easier if I just expand my screen, highlight this, copy it, and now it's going to hard code inside of our dashboard that ID. This is clearly not how you want to normally do this, but for our testing use cases, this will work just fine. Let's get rid of all these extra spaces that are in there. Now if we save, we go over to our application, and we of course get cannot read property doc of undefined. So if we go back over to our use folder, it looks like it's saying it cannot read doc of folder, and that's because there should be folders. Our database is called folders, and there we go. So if we inspect, we should have that doc being printed out to us. So we can see here we have this element T, which contains our doc. And you see it's kind of a mess. There's really not that much useful information inside of here. And that's because to get pretty much all of the information other than the ID of the document, you need to call something called the data method. So we can say doc.data and call that as a function. And that's actually going to give us all the data that we care about. As you can see here, we have our created at, our name, our parent ID, and our user ID. We've converted all of the useless information into some useful information. If we want the ID, we just say doc.id. So really what we want to do is convert this doc into a usable format. We can easily do that by just saying that our formatted doc is equal to, it's going to be our ID, which is our doc.id, and we're just going to spread out the doc.data. Now if I print out formatted doc, this should be exactly what we want. And let's just inspect over here to make sure. Go to our console, you can see we have an object which has our created at, name, parent ID, user ID, and then finally, of course, our ID. This is all the information that we care about. And since we're going to do this all the time, I actually want to turn this section right here into its own function inside of our Firebase. We're just going to call this format doc. And this is going to be a function. And this function is going to take in a doc just like that. And I just going to return the exact code we had there. So doc.id and spread out our doc.data. There we go. Now we have our format doc function, which we can actually use. So here, whoops, not here, instead of our use folder, instead of doing all this code, we can just say format doc, and that's database, .format doc, pass it in the doc, and that'll do all that code for us. Now we inspect, we should get the exact same result to the console, and we do. So now I just want to copy this dispatch, and instead of using our root folder, I just want to use our formatted folder here. So now when we have an ID, our currently selected folder is going to be based on the folder we get from our database. If we go into our dashboard and just say console.log folder, we should actually see the folder being printed out now as our current folder. We go to the console, you can see right here, our folder is being printed out just as we expect. It's null for a little bit until finally the database tells us what the folder is, and then it prints it out right here. So now that we're able to access the current folder that we're on, the next thing I want to do is access all of the child folders. Because right now we've set our folder manually to this folder. So if we create a new folder, it should have this as the parent ID. And let's just test that. We're going to call this child. Now if we go back over here and we look at this new child, you can see the parent ID is that P9HF, which is this manual ID we set. So we're able to actually create child folders. So now we have a child folder inside of our main parent folder, which is this folder here just called ASDF. So now what I want to do is render out those children folders onto our page, just like we've done over here. So to do that, we need to again, of course, create a new component. This new component, we're just going to call folder.js, use that little RFC trick to generate out of the boilerplate. And all I want to do in here is pass it a folder, which is the folder that we're going to render. For now, I'm just going to print out the folder.name because we don't really care about anything else. So we're just going to print out the folder name. We go into our dashboard and we import that folder component. So /folder, just like that. We can actually come down here, and if we really wanted to, we could just render out folder and pass it our current folder. And now you can see that it's rendering out the name of our current folder. And of course, it says cannot read name of null. That's because at the very beginning, our folder is null. So to get around that, just temporarily, we'll just say folder and this. So it'll only render if folder is not null. And there you go. We can see it prints out the name of our folder. That's great. But of course, we want to render our child folders, not just our folder that's current. So instead, we want to loop through all of our children folders and render them. So what I want to do is I just want to create a section here that if our child folders, which we're going to get up here from our use hook, our child folders .length is greater than 0, and that means we have some folders. What I want to do is render some code inside of here. So Inside of here, I can just say, I want to render a div. I'm going to give it a class name of dflex and flex wrap. This is just a container that contains all of our child folders. And then I'm going to loop through each one of these child folders and print them out as that component. But first, I want to actually wrap them inside of a div. And this div is going to allow me to do a little bit of styling. So first thing first, obviously you need to put a key on it, which is our folder ID. We're going to have a style here. And the main reason for this is just to specify a max width. Of course, I spelled it wrong, max width of 250 pixels, just so it's not too wide. And finally, our class name of p-2 to give us some spacing between our different folders. So now if we close off that div, just like this, inside of that div, we can render out that folder component. We can pass in our child folder as it. We can rename this even to child folder just to make it a little bit more straightforward what folder we're referencing. So now we have a div wrapping our folder, and it's going to print out each one of our child folders inside of this section. Of course, though, we aren't populating our child folders yet, because inside of use folder, we're just setting them up here to an empty array. So we need, you guessed it, another use effect to handle this. So use effect, inside of this use effect, pretty much any time that our folder ID changes, we want to run this use effect. Now this use effect is going to be a little bit different than most other use effects. That we're going to have our database.folders. We want to do a search here. So we want to say where, and we want to search where the parent ID is equal to, and we want to search where it's equal to our folder ID. And you'll notice this kind of weird format syntax. This is the way that Firebase works. You pass in the property you want to search for, in our case, parent ID. You pass in the check, in our case, equal to, and then you pass in the value you want to check against that property. We're checking where the parent ID equals our folder ID. Also, we need to do another where check because we want to make sure we only get folders that are created by our current user. So where user ID is equal to our current user.uid. And since we're using our current user in this effect, we need to create our current user as one of the parameters that when they change, we reset this entire use effect. Let's just save this to get it formatted a little bit better. And then the next thing I want to do is order this by the created at field, just so that they always stay in the same order that we created them at. Super simple. That'll be nice. And then we're going to use something called onSnapshot. This is the real kicker. This is the important part. Essentially, this is going to run code every single time a new folder is created or anytime a folder is changed or edited. This onSnapshot function is going to run to tell us what the new set of folders that meet this criteria are. So we can just create a simple dispatch here. And all we need to do is tell it the type, which in our case is actions dot, and we're going to call this update child folders. And actually, instead of update, we're going to call this set because we want to completely set the child folders. And our payload is just going to be our child folders. We can get this from our snapshot. We want to get all of the documents and we want to format them. So we're going to map over our format doc function. So essentially all that this code's doing, if I just expand this a little bit to make it a little easier to read, and make sure I format this properly, what we're doing is we're running some action called set child folders, which we have yet to create. And then we're taking all the folders, which are these documents, and we're just making sure we format them properly, just like we did up here in this use effect for formatting our document. But now we're doing it inside of an array, which is why it's in this map. Now if we come up here, we can create that set child folders, which is just set child folders. This is going to be almost the same as updating our folder. All we're going to do is say set child folders, and our child folders are going to be set to our payload.child folders. Now, of course, we're getting some errors. Current user is not defined. That's because in here, we're not defining our current user anywhere. So we can say current user is equal to use auth. And let's just make sure we import that properly. So use auth imported right there. We now have our current user. And if we save, hopefully this should refresh and work. And of course, it says cannot read property where of undefined. I did the same thing. This should be folders instead of folder. And now, of course, all of our stuff is working as we expect. Now what we can do is we can say that we want to return this onSnapshot. And you may think that sounds really weird. And the reason why is because onSnapshot returns a function that allows us to clean up this snapshot. So this would be like a cleanup function, clean up. And then whenever you need to clean this up, essentially stop listening, you would just call cleanup, and that would stop the listening. And in React, whatever you return from a use effect So if we return to this, it'll run this cleanup function every single time our parameters change, so that way we have a new snapshot to listen to. But we can kind of shortcut all that by just doing the return up here, and that'll do all the work for us. So anytime that these parameters change down here, it's going to make sure that it reruns all of this code and cleans up our old listener, so we only ever have one listener at a time. Now with all that done, hopefully inside of our dashboard, we can print out our child folders, and we should actually have folders being printed out. So if I inspect this, go to the console, we of course have empty arrays and we have an error. It says error in snapshot listener, the query requires an index. You can create it here. What that's essentially saying is that we need to create an index for our folder, if we go over to use folder, that is on parent ID, user ID, and created at. If we just get rid of this created at for now, there's no longer going to be that error. And you can see instead, we're getting new errors. So let's look at these first to see what they are. It says cannot read property of ID of null, cannot perform React state-up. And this is just our folder.id. It's saying that there's no ID for some of our folders that it's generating from this formatting of our documents. So if we look at the code over here, you can see child folders, we're mapping over them. And then here we're using folder.id instead of child folder.id. So in our dashboard, let's just make sure that this here says child folder.id. Now, hopefully that gets rid of the errors, and you can see it prints out our name child. If we go back to our console, we should have no errors. And as you can see, we have no errors, and it prints out our one child object with all of the data inside of it. That's exactly what we expect. But if we go back to our use folder and we put that order by in there, it's now going to stop working. And that's because we don't have that index created. So there's two ways to do this. One way, you click on this link and it'll automatically create the index for you. Pretty straightforward. Or you can manually create indexes inside of your Cloud Firestore here by clicking create index and type in all the fields that you want. For our case, I'm just going to use the link version because it's way easier. So once that loads up, I'm going to zoom this in so it's a little easier to see. Essentially, it says the fields that we want to have an index on, the scope that we're querying on, as well as the collection ID. We just click create, and it's going to run through all of this for us. And you notice this format is not nearly as nice as this Firebase format over here, but it's a one-click thing and it does it for us. It takes a little while to run, especially if you have a lot of data. So we're just going to leave it run in the background, and eventually it's going to fix itself and work. So we can kind of just close out of that, come back over to here, go back to our data. And if we refresh this, and, we hit inspect, it's still not going to work because it says that that index does not exist. So we're just going to comment this out for the time being, so that way we can still see our folders. And then hopefully by the time we're done formatting and styling it, we can add this back in because it'll have created the index by then. And we can keep tabs on it by over here, just waiting for our index. You can see the status is building right now. So once that's complete, we'll be able to actually add this back in. So now, like I said, let's work on the styling of our actual folder icon because it's going to be pretty straightforward. We just want this really simple format that's like a button we can click on. So let's go into folder.js, and here, instead of having a div, we want to have a link tag because we want this to be something that we can click on. And inside that link tag, we want to print out our folder name, but we also want to have a font awesome icon of our folder. So of course, we need to import font awesome icon from @FortAwesome. We want to get the React one here, and we need to import the icon we want, which is just called FA folder, and that's from our free solid SVG icon set. Now in here, what we can do is we can print out our font awesome icon. Our icon for that is going to be equal to that FA folder icon. And I'm just going to give it a little margin on the right hand side of 2. That way it spaces itself out slightly from our folder name. We save that. We should see over here. Of course, we're getting a failure. It says link is not defined. We just need to import link from React router DOM. Now, hopefully that should get rid of that error for us. And as you can see, we now have this link showing up. But of course, the styling is really, really ugly. To fix this, I'm actually going to change this to a bootstrap a button instead of a link. And I'm just going to use as link to set it to a link. And let's just make sure we import button from React Bootstrap. Now, if we save that, it should hopefully look a little bit better. There we go. Now we can kind of change it to give it that darker style. So we're going to change the variant here. And the variant is going to be outline dark. Now, if we save, we'll get that dark-ish outline, just like that, exactly what we want. And then to make it a little bit better, to just finalize our styles, we're going to come in here with a class name. Our class name is going to be text truncate and width 100. That's just going to make sure it always truncates our text for us and doesn't expand too far if our name is really long. So if we were to add another folder, we're just going to give it a really long name here. Now let's add that folder. You can see immediately our code right here for our snapshot has automatically figured out we added that folder and populated it onto our page. And also you'll notice it truncates the name if the text gets too long, past the maximum width that we set right here of 250 pixels. We change this to, for example, 150 pixels, you'll notice it'll shrink down that maximum size for us. So you can really play around with this number to see how large or how wide you want your different icons to be. With all that done, let's come over here to check on the status. Let's just refresh this to see if it's finished building. It says it's still building. Like I said, it takes a little while, so we'll keep that commented out for now, and we can move on to the next step, which is rendering out our breadcrumbs up here, where it tells us what sections we're in, this breadcrumb right here. Also, before we do that, we should probably make it so that our link actually goes somewhere, because right now our link doesn't go anywhere. So let's give it a to property, and we're going to tell it that it's going to go to an interesting place. This to is actually going to be going to /folder/ and we want to get our folder ID. So when we click on this link, it's going to redirect us to /folder and give it an ID. So let's just come back over to here, and we're going to click on one of these. And you'll notice up here, our URL says folder, and then the ID of that folder. And that's where we want to redirect ourselves to. So if we go back to our dashboard, we want to be able to render things that have a folder ID. So to do that, we need to go all the way back to our routing in our app.js and create a brand new route. This is going to be a private route. We'll just use exact again. And the path here instead is going to be a dynamic path. So it's going to be /folders/folder ID. And again, the component for this is going to be our dashboard. So we want to render the exact same component, but now we actually are passing it a folder ID. And let me just make sure I type this as folder instead of folder ID. So now hopefully our page will refresh and it actually renders out our hard-coded folder. So instead, we want to change it to render out the folder with the ID we pass into it. So if we go all the way back to our dashboard here, I want to get this URL parameter, and we can get that using React Router. So React Router has this really nice thing called useParam, which we're going to import useParam. It's actually called useParams, sorry, from React Router, router DOM. So here, above our use folder hook here, we can say that we want to use param to get our folder ID. Use params. So essentially, we just call this function and it gives us all the parameters as an object. We're destructuring that because we only care about the folder ID. And then we can pass that folder ID in here to this use folder. So now if I save this, you can see that we're redirected to that child folder. And if I get rid of all of this, it should hopefully redirect us to our root folder. There we go. If we click on this, it'll now redirect us to that folder. Now we're inside the child folder and so on. So now that we have that working, we can move on to working on the breadcrumbs. Now to create these breadcrumbs, we're going to do that inside of our container. We're actually going to create a div, which we're just going to put all of our items inside of. We're going to have dflex here. We want to align our items in the center. And if we just close this off, we put our add folder button inside of here. We're also going to put our folder breadcrumbs inside of here. So we'll have folder breadcrumbs, which is a component we're going to create. And of course, we need access to the current folder we're in. Otherwise, we can't get the breadcrumbs if we don't know what folder we're in. Now we need to create that folder breadcrumbs component. Pretty easy, folder breadcrumbs.js, and use that RFC trick just to generate all the boilerplate code. And of course, we're going to pass it in a current folder as a parameter. Now let's just make sure in our dashboard we import this component. So we'll say import folder breadcrumbs from /folder breadcrumbs. And now we should hopefully get rid of this error, just like that. And in our folder breadcrumbs, we need to, of course, render out breadcrumbs, and we'll use the breadcrumb from Bootstrap to do that. So we'll say breadcrumb, and we want to get that from React Bootstrap, just like that. And here, instead of a div, we're just going to do our breadcrumb, and we want to make sure that we close this off. Breadcrumb, there we go. So now what we need to do is essentially loop through all the folders that come before our current folder and render them out as breadcrumb items, and then lastly, render out our current folder as a breadcrumb item. So the first thing I want to do is just render out our current folder. So if we have a current folder, then what I want to do is render out a item for our breadcrumb for that current folder. So we can say breadcrumb.item, and inside of here, we're going to put our current folder. So we'll just say current folder.name. That's going to render out the name. And then I want a few properties here. We're going to put some class names of text, truncate, and dinline block. That's just to make sure our text will disappear if it passes our maximum width, which we're going to define right now. So our style for our max width is going to be 200 pixels, just so we can truncate anything that's a little bit too long. Then finally, we're going to set this to active since we want this to be the one that is currently active so we can't click on it. Also, you'll notice it has this weird background color and this weird padding. I don't want any of that. So instead of our breadcrumb, we can say list props, which are going to pass some properties to our list. And we can just say we want to pass some class names, which are going to be background white and padding 0. Now, if we save that, we're of course getting an error. And that's just because here, that should be not an equal sign, it should be a colon. And now you can see that we got rid of all of those weirdness that's going on. Also, I want to make sure that this breadcrumb grows, be the full size. So I'll say flex grow 1. And that'll just push everything else over onto the side like this. And that's why we have our breadcrumbs here and then everything else to the side. Also, we want to get rid of the margin on the bottom of this whole thing. So we can say M0 as well. That's just going to get rid of the margin on the bottom. And we actually need to do that on our list instead. So we can say M0 here. And that's going to get rid of the margin on the bottom, which centers this item with our button over here. You'll also notice our content is like pressed right up against the top of the screen here. So instead of doing padding 0, I'm just going to do padding on the left of 0. That'll return the padding on the top and bottom, which is exactly what we want. So now it's a little spaced away from the top of the screen, and that looks a little bit better. It just gives us some spacing. Right now we're rendering out just one breadcrumb for our current item that we've selected. But that's not super useful. Like if I go back all the way here, hit enter, you can see we've rendered out our root. Now we rendered out the current folder we're in, and again the current folder we're in. But again, that's not super useful. I want to render out the breadcrumb for all the things that come before as well. If you remember a little ways back in our add folder button, we had this path that we were talking about. The reason this path is so useful is it's going to give us a path to all the folders that come before this current folder in order. This is really useful so we can render out our breadcrumbs. Otherwise, when we render our breadcrumbs, we need to actually access each folder individually by ID, which is going to be a lot of unnecessary calls to the database, and it's just not worth it. So instead, when we create a folder, we're going to save the path to that folder inside this path variable. To do this, I'm just going to create a variable up here, const path, and this path is going to be by default set to our current folder.path. So we're going to get our current folder's path and set that as our current path. Then what I want to do is if our current folder is not equal to the root folder, then what I want to do is I want to take our path and I want to add in a new variable for our current folder. We can say name is our current folder.name and our ID is our current folder.id. And the reason I'm doing this only for folders that aren't our root folder is because, like I said, our root folder is like this made up thing that we've created. It's not actually in the database. We don't want to save this as a part of our path because the root folder is not actually a database element. So now we've taken our current path, and we've added on the current folder to the end of that path, and now we can put that path inside of the database. So if we save this, you're going to notice it says root folder is not defined. We need to import that root folder, and right now that's defined inside of use folder. So up here, let's make sure we export this root folder, and then inside of our add folder button, we can import root folder. We get that from, just go back a little ways. We can go into our hooks/use folder, and now this should get rid of that error for us, just like that. Now what we can do is we can create a folder. Let's go all the way to our root, and we're going to create a folder called @root. Add this folder. We go into here. You can see, hopefully, if we refresh this, our status will no longer be building. You can see it's enabled. So we can actually now go over to our, our use folder hook. And we can make sure that we sort by created at, because now that index is built. But now we can go over to our data here. For that new folder we just created, let's find it, @root, and you can see our path right now is just an empty array. There's nothing inside the path because that was our root folder we created. So now that we're inside that @root, let's create another folder called in@root. Actually, to make it a little simpler, we'll just call it child1. Add that folder. Now inside of here, we can find that child1 that we just created. We can see here child1 now has a path, and that path has the name of the parent, which is @root, as well as the ID for that parent. Let's add another thing inside of child1. We're going to call this grandchild1. And now if we find that in here, let's just do a little quick search for it. And there it is. You can see now the path has both the grandparent as well as the parent in the correct order. So we can render out this path inside of our breadcrumbs and navigate between them. So to do this, let's go over to our folder breadcrumbs. And what we want to do is we want to get our path. We're going to create a variable called path. We're going to set it to our current folder. We're going to say if our current folder is our root folder, then we don't have a path. So if our current folder is our root folder, our path is just an empty array. Otherwise, our path is going to start with our root folder. Because essentially we're going to say we want to see if we're in the root folder. If we're in the root folder, we don't have a path because we're in the root folder. Otherwise, our path will start with the root folder. And the reason we're doing this is because we don't save our root folder inside the database. So we need to add that manually. Then if we have a current folder, what I want to do is I want to take our path, I want to set it to our path that we've gotten up here. And then I just want to add in our current folder.path. So essentially, if we're in the root folder, this isn't going to do anything. But if we're not in the root folder, this is going to take this path, which starts with root folder, and add on all of our other elements to the end of it. Then what we can do is loop through that path. So we can say that we want to go through each one of our path variables. We want to map over them. We could say .map. We have a folder and we have an index. And we just get rid of this real quick. So we have path.map. And for each one, we have a folder and an index. Inside of here, I want to do the exact same thing. I want to render out a breadcrumb item. And I'm actually just going to copy this breadcrumb item right here because it's going to share a lot of the same stuff. Except for, of course, we don't want this to be active. So we're going to remove that active class. And we want to get our folder.name instead of our current folder.name. And we, of course, need a key, which is our folder.id. I also want to change our width here to be a little bit smaller. We're going to use 150 pixels because these aren't as important. And also, I want this to be a link. So we can say link as, we want to use the class of link, that component, I'm sorry, which comes from our React router. So we get link from React router, just like that. We're just converting our link here to use that. And let's just make sure we actually return this by using parentheses here instead of curly braces. Rid of this auto added semicolon. And hopefully if we save, it again says root folder is not defined. So we need to import root folder. That's coming from // and that's our hooks / folder, just like that. Now that should hopefully get rid of that error. And of course you can see our breadcrumbs are being printed out. But right now our link doesn't actually go anywhere. If we click on this, it doesn't do anything. So we need to give it a to property, which is going to come from our link props because we have our link as. Now we're passing our link props. And our link props here are just going to be a to prop, which is going to go to that folders. So we can say /folders. And we want to go to /folders / our folder.id. Now let's see if this actually does anything. We click on @root. You're going to notice it looks like it should work, but it really doesn't. We just inspect our page, see if we have any errors. We don't have any errors. And it looks like, of course, this should be /folder instead of /folders. Again, I typed that incorrectly. So now if we just go back, refresh this, click on @root, you can see it redirected us back here. Click on root, redirects us here, but we have an error because it says current folder path is not iterable. Folder /null, there is no folder with that null index. So here we just want to say if our folder.id, if we have a folder ID, redirect to it. Otherwise, that means we're on the root folder, so redirect to the root. So now, let's save that. Let's make sure we redirect ourselves to the root. And let's just navigate down a few folders. And of course here, current folder.path is not iterable. This is mostly because we have folders in here that don't have a path. So anything that doesn't have a path, we want to delete. This is just old data. So we can delete this. Let's delete the document. Let's see, this one, no path, so we're going to delete it. This one right here has a path, it's fine. This one has a path, it's fine. This one has no path, so we're going to delete it. This is just so we can get rid of all of our old data that happened before we added our path. So delete this one. This one has a path, and then we can delete this one. So hopefully this error should go away. So now, if we go back to our page, just refresh real quick, you can see, of course, we still get an error. Current folder.path is not iterable. So one thing we can do is we can check inside of our use folder. We scroll all the way up to our root folder. We can see we do have a path here, so that is correct. Now we can go into our folder breadcrumbs. We just need to figure out what folder we're currently on that is not iterable with a path. So we can just say console.log current folder. Let's just see what our current folder is. We just inspect this real quick, go to our console. You can see it looks like we have a bunch of errors, but our current folder is just an ID. There's actually no document associated with this. That's just because we don't have access to this folder. So let's just close out of this, go back to our root. We essentially deleted that folder. That was why we were getting that error. And now we can essentially say, we're going to click on our @root, child1, grandchild1, and you'll notice something really interesting. If I go in and slow down my network speed to be really slow, we'll say slow 3G, and I click on @root, you'll notice that our breadcrumbs disappear and then reappear. Disappear, reappear. Disappear, reappear. It's kind of a weird phenomenon. You would think that they would just stay there the entire time. Like if I click grandchild 1, it shouldn't like disappear everything except for root and then reappear. It should just disappear, or should just stay there, I'm sorry. And we can even make it really slow. I have this custom preset, and when I click, you can see they stay gone for a very long period of time before they reappear. This is something we can actually quite easily fix by, instead of passing just a to property to our link, we also need to pass it a state. A state is essentially some piece of data you can pass along when you change your route. So if I click on this child 1 or I click on @root, I want to pass along the folder that I'm currently in so that I can keep this route currently navigated to the correct location. So here, instead of doing a just route here, I want to pass an object, and the path name is going to be what we normally pass to 2. And I also want to pass it some state. And the state is going to be an object that contains a folder, and this folder is just our current folder that we're on, that we clicked on, so we can just spread out our folder. But I want to replace the path of this folder with a new path. So I can say our path is going to be path.slice from 1 to the index. Now this may seem a little confusing, so let me explain exactly what is going on here. Essentially what's happening is we're going to be passing some state information along with our route. So right now we have a route that passes our ID. We're also going to pass state, which is this object. This object has a folder property, which is just our current folder right here. But our current folder doesn't contain the path information, because if we look in one of these, you can see one that has a path. All it has is the ID and the name. So we're going to put the path on it. And by saying path.slice, we're taking everything from the first element inside of our array. So if we have one that has multiple elements like this, we're taking everything from the first element up to the current index. So if we clicked on @root, it's going to take everything from this first element all the way to the current index, which is the root we clicked on. That way it's not going to get any of the information that comes after it. We're essentially only getting the elements in the path associated with the current folder that we clicked on. So now, if I come over here and click on, for example, child 1, grandchild, and I click on @root, you're going to notice we still get that flash. It's very quick, but it's still there. And that's because we're not taking advantage of our state anywhere. We need to do that here. So to get the state from React Router, we use a hook called useLocation. That allows us to get a ton of information, but one of that pieces of information is our state. And by default, we want to just set it to an empty object. And we're going to get that from useLocation. And then in here, we can pass our state.folder, which is the data we passed along. So now, if I just go along here, we'll go all the way to grandchild, and I'll click child 1. You'll notice we don't get any of that weird flashing. All the information stays here. Now, if I click this folder, we get the flash, and that's because inside of our folder component, we're not passing along any of our state information. So instead here, I want to pass an object that has a path name equal to the path name we currently were using, just like that. And I also want to pass along our state, so we can say comma state. And the state is just going to be our folder, and it's going to be inside of an object just like this. Now, hopefully, if I were to click on child 1, you can see none of this path stuff flashes. It still works just as we would expect. And that looks really nice. It looks a lot cleaner, and it just looks better overall, gives a better user experience, and it's pretty easy for us to change this and make it work. So now before we start venturing on to the file portion, because we've pretty much finished everything related to folders, the next thing I want to do is work on Firebase rules. If we go over to this rules tab, at the very beginning when we set this up, we essentially said we want this to work in development mode. And that just allows us to do anything. Literally anything in the database as long as the timestamp is before a certain date. Essentially, it allows us to do anything for a certain period of time, and then it'll cut us off. Instead, what we want to do is we want to set up specific rules for all of the information inside of our database. So what I want to do is I want different rules for reading, writing, updating, creating, and so on. So down here, I can say I want to allow read if certain things are true. So I want to allow read if, for example, our user is authenticated. So we're going to create a function called auth. And I want to make sure that our user matches. So we're going to say matches user. And we're going to pass it in the data for the call that we are doing to this read. So let's create these functions up here. We can say we have a function called auth. And we also are going to have a function called matches user. This is going to take in our data. So instead of our auth function, this is the more straightforward one. We just want to return if our data has an auth. So we can say return request dot auth. I'm going to make sure that's not equal to null. So if we have data and authentication, this will return true if someone's logged in. If they're not logged in, it'll return false. So we can say, is someone logged in? Okay. Also, is this user that's logged in matching the user associated with this data? If you remember, in all of our data, if I just publish this real quick, Now, of course, we're getting an error. We just need to make sure we return here. We'll just return true for now. So now if I publish this, it'll let us go. If we go over to our data, you can see every single one of our pieces of data has this user ID. So we want to check to see if the data we pass has that user ID. So we can say if we have our request.auth.uid, this is our user ID. If that equals our user ID of our data, then return true, otherwise return false. So now we're only allowing a user to read data, both if they're authenticated and if they also are the user associated with that folder. Now we can publish this. Hopefully it all works. There we go. Now if we refresh over here, we won't notice any changes. But if, for example, I were to log out, so I go to my profile, I just do a quick log out, and I come in here and I type in a new user. So we'll just sign up test2 at test.com. Give them a generic password, sign them up. So now if we try to access a folder from another user, so if we just go back to our data, we just copy a random folder ID and we try to go to that exact folder. So we say /folder/that ID, hit enter. You're going to notice we're actually redirected back to the root folder. And that's because in our code, if we go way over here, you'll notice, and it's in our folder, scroll up to this very first, our second use effect, sorry. What we do is if we catch an error, then we update our folder here. So let's just get that error object. And we'll just say console.error, our error. And now if we inspect our page over here, we should have an error being printed out of the console that says missing or insufficient permissions. So we tried to access a folder that the user that we are currently signed in as does not have access to, so it threw an error, and by default we're catching that error and redirecting the user back to the root folder, essentially saying you don't have access to that folder. So that's a really great catch that we've implemented by doing this allow read here to make sure they're both signed in and match the user that we're currently using. The next thing I want to do is if we'll just come back here, log out of this current user, and we're going to log in as our actual user, test.com, password, so we have all of our information. The next thing I want to do is allowing create. And the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that you're signed in. So if auth, and I want to make sure that you also are matching the user of the thing you're trying to create. And instead of doing resource.data, what we want to do instead is get this information from our request. So we can say request.resource.data. This is going to be the information we actually pass up to our request. So we can just publish this real quick. And now what this is saying is we can only create information. We can only create a folder if we're both logged in and our user ID matches the user ID we are saving to that folder. So inside of our add folder code, we just expand this so it's easier to read. Down here where we're setting our current user ID right here, we're making sure that this matches. So if we were to change this to something else, we're going to get an error when we try to create a folder. So if I try to create a folder here, add it, you're going to notice it doesn't actually get added. If I go to the console, we're going to get an error right here that says missing or insufficient permissions because I tried to create a folder with a user ID different than my user ID. If I change this back and I now create a folder, you can see it added it just fine, and we're not going to get that error in the console, and that's because our user ID matches the user ID we passed up with that folder. So that's awesome. We now have read and create permissions set up where only the user that is accessing the data can read it, and only the user that's creating the data can actually create it. This just adds a lot of security to our application. So now with all of that done, we can finally move on to actually adding files instead of just creating empty folders. So let's create a brand new add file button.js component, do a little RFC trick, and inside of our dashboard, let's make sure we import that. So we just copy this, the add file button, and from add file button. There we go. And down here, we can just have our add file button, pass in our current folder, which is equal to our folder, and close it off. So now we have our add file button, which right now is completely empty, not doing anything. So we should actually make it do something. First thing, it accepts a current folder. Now inside of here, what I want to do is I want to create a label, which is going to be a little interesting. The reason I'm using a label is that I can automatically click on the input file button, and this is just going to allow us to create a custom file input. So I want to also create an input for inputting that file. So we're just going to use an input with a type equal to file, and an on change, which is going to be equal to handle upload, which is a function we're going to create up here. Function handle upload. Going to take in that event parameter right now. I'm not going to really worry about this too much. And then also lastly inside of here, I want some styles. I essentially just want to hide this thing. So I'm going to set the opacity to 0. I want to set the position to absolute. just like that. And then lastly, I want to set the left to negative 9,999 pixels. Essentially, just make it completely off the edge of the screen, invisible, completely blank. It does not exist to the user. What we're going to do is interact with this label, which I want to style to look a lot like a button. So we're going to say button outline success, button small, margin is going to be 0, and our margin on the right is going to be 2, just to push it a little bit away from the side of the screen. So now if I save that, you can see we have a button, which is empty. For now, let's just add a font awesome icon. Oops, make sure I spell it correctly. So it's font awesome icon, and the icon inside of here is going to be equal to fa icon file upload, just like that. Make sure that these get imported up here, just like they have. And now if we close that off, save it again, we should have the correct icon just like that. And actually what I want to do is I want to swap the order of these buttons, just like that. Now there's spacing between them, just as you can see here. So we have upload file and upload this folder. And if I click this upload file, it's going to be exactly the same as if I clicked this input, which we've created here, but the input is completely hidden based on these styles. But since we wrapped it in this label, it associates it with this input. So when we click on the label, it's going to do the on change for our input here. So now in our handle upload, I want to get our file, which is just e.target.files. I want to get the first one because we're only doing one. And if for some reason our current folder is equal to null, or our file is equal to null, for example, they just don't choose a file, then I just want to return. I don't want to do anything else. Now the next thing I want to do is actually upload this file to our Firebase. And in Firebase, we have something called storage here where we can upload all of our data to. So I want to upload it to our Firebase storage. Now to do that, we need to modify our Firebase here. So we want to import firebase/storage. I want to export a variable, which is going to be called storage, which is equal to app.storage, just like that. Same thing as our auth, same thing as our Firestore up here. They work exactly the same. So now inside of our add file button, I can have access to that storage. Now the first thing I want to do is to determine the file path, essentially the folder path for this. So we can say const file path is equal to, and this is going to determine if we have a path. So current folder.path.length, if that is greater than 0, then what I want to do down here is get our current folder.path. I want to join that on this slash symbol. Essentially, I want to take the names of all of our folders and concatenate them so our file path has all those folders in it. Then at the very end, I want to take our file.name and add it to the end. So we have all of our folders leading up to our file's name itself. Otherwise, if that's not the case, I just want our file to be in file.name. So essentially our file path here, if we have a set of folders, essentially a path, I want to make sure that that's at the beginning of our file. Otherwise, just do the file name as the file path. Then down here, I can create what's called an upload task. This is how you manage uploads inside of Firebase. And this is just going to be storage.ref. This is going to point to the location where we want to upload this. So this is going to be uploaded in /files/ we want to get our current user.id, which of course we need to import our current user. We'll do that in just a little bit. And our file path, again, needs to be string interpolation. So here, essentially all we've done is we've used a root folder called files. For our individual user, we have a new folder, and then our file path, which we created up here. That's where we're going to be saving this upload task to. And we want to put this specific file in that location. So we've created an upload task, which is at this location, and we're putting this file inside of there. So in order to get our current user, let's just make sure we input use auth from ... and we need to go back one more into our context /auth context. And then here, const current user equals use auth, and make sure we wrap this just like that. There we go. Now we have access to our current user. And now we have this upload task itself. So right here with this on its own, technically this is going to add files for us. So if we come into here, of course we're getting storage is not defined. Let's make sure we import storage from, we need to go way back all the way to Firebase. And now hopefully that should go away. We can upload a file. Let's just choose this random image. And it's going to take a little bit of time to upload, but if we come in here and refresh, we should hopefully see that we now have a file. Inside of this files folder, we have undefined, so clearly this is incorrect. We need this to say user ID, which is UID instead of just ID. But either way, inside that folder, we now have our bridge.jpg. So if we just re-upload a file again, let's just do this trees.jpg. Now if we come into files, we have that correct user folder ID and trees.jpg. And if I were to go into DSGF folder and I upload a file, let's just do that bridge one. Now if I go back to the beginning into that user, we have now our bridge and our trees.jpg showing up. This is not quite right though, because we're in this folder DSG, whatever it is. So it should be putting that inside of that folder, but right now it's not. So clearly something about our file path is incorrect. Just do a quick console.log of our current folder.path. Then also down here, let's just do a log of our file path itself. Let's just see what this looks like. So we come in here, let's just upload our bridge, and we're going to inspect down here, go to our console, and you can see that our path right now has a length of 0, and we have our bridge.jpg. So the reason that this error is happening is because our current folder technically has no path, so it's fallbacking to this, but we're not actually including the current folder itself inside of our path. Our current folder should be included inside of this path here at some point. So I'm going to rename this to parent path. And what I want to do then is I want to create a separate variable called file path, and this will be slightly different. This is going to say if the current folder is equal to the root folder, which we're going to have to import up here, just like that. So if it's equal to our root folder, then what I want to do is just our file path is going to be equal to our parent path. So we'll say parent path. Otherwise, if it's not equal to the root folder, then what I want to do is append my current folder's name onto my parent path. So what I can just do here is say, I want to get my parent path, and I want to add in my current folder.name, just like that. Make sure I spell current correctly. And now our file path here should hopefully be correct. So let's just try that again. We're going to upload a file here. We're going to upload this trees. And now instead of here, let's just go all the way back to the very beginning, our files, our user, and now we have trees.jpg / and then our folder. So clearly this is a little bit flip-flopped of how it should be, and that's because our file name shouldn't be appended onto the end up here. It should be appended down here. And this should just be an empty string. And then here, our parent path should include at the end of it our file name. So like that. So in order to explain exactly what this is, since it's a little bit confusing, I kind of messed it up a little bit. Up here, we're just getting the path for our folder, which is our current folder path joined on these slashes. And actually, we can simplify this a step further by just replacing parent path with this. We don't even need this at all. So now what we've done is we take and determine if we're in the root folder. If we're in the root folder, ignore our current folder's name. Just take all the paths, combine them with the slash, and then add the file name to the end. Otherwise, if we're not in the root folder, still take the path, also take the current folder's name, and then append here the file name at the end. Now, hopefully, this should work. First, to test this, I'm just going to kind of delete everything. I'm going to delete all the files we currently have, just to get a fresh, clean slate. And I'm going to upload our bridge.jpg, and I'm going to upload here our trees.jpg. So the trees should be in the root, and the bridge should not. So if I refresh this, we go into our files, into our current user, and you can see trees is at the root. And now we go into this folder, and now we have bridges at this section. So we're able to now properly put the files in the correct folder using this code and this code combined together. But one problem is we don't have this information in our database. It's only saved in our Firebase storage. We also need to save this in our Firebase database. So what we can do is use upload task, and we can actually determine when we finished uploading. So we can use this onStateChanged event, and this is going to allow us to determine when things are changing as well as when our upload finishes or if there's any errors. And this actually takes 3 separate functions. The first function is going to be the function that gets called repeatedly, telling us our progress of upload, essentially our upload progress. And for now, we're just going to leave this blank. We're not going to worry about it. The next function is going to be what happens on error. Again, we're going to ignore that for now. The final function you pass to this is going to be the function that happens after the upload has finished itself completely. What we want to do in here is take our upload task, we want to get to the snapshot, and we want to get the actual thing that we're uploading, and we want to get the download URL for it. And this is a promise, so this will return to us the URL. We can just say console.log URL for now. Now if I come in here and I just try to upload a file, we'll upload this random trees.jpg, and I inspect, go to the console, you can see I get this URL. If I click on this, it goes to the download for that exact file. So now I've got the download URL. I can actually use all of the information I have to save this into the database. So to do this, let's just get database from Firestore, just like that. And here, instead of just doing a log, we're going to say database.files.add. And in here, I want to add a file with our URL. I want to also take the name, which is our file.name. I want to set the created at. I want this to be equal to essentially our current timestamp. So database.get current timestamp. Then our folder ID, this is where we uploaded it to, is just going to be our current folder.id. And then lastly, I want the user that uploaded it. So we're going to say current user.uid. So now, hopefully, as soon as we finish our upload, this should be saved into our database. So let's do one final upload here. We'll do our bridge.jpg. And if we come back here, we go all the way back to our Cloud Firestore. Inside of files, we now have that file that we just uploaded. It has the created at date, the name of bridge.jpg, the URL where we can access it, the user that uploaded it, and the folder ID is null because we're not in a folder. We go into a folder and upload, for example, this bridge.jpg. Now you can see this should add itself here as soon as it finishes uploading. Might take a little bit, might even need to refresh for it to show up. Still not showing up. So let's see maybe if we have an error happening. So let's just inspect. Go into our console. I don't see anything being printed out into the console, but most likely we have an error because this didn't actually populate anything. In order to make sure it wasn't just a fluke, let's just try one more time uploading. Do trees.jpg this time. And there we go. It looks like maybe I just didn't do my upload properly. So now if I click on this, you can see our folder ID is the ID of the folder that we're currently in, which allows us to get essentially the child files as well as the child folders. So now before we continue on with this path of this add file button, I want to go back to our use folder hook because now we can do a separate use effect to get our folder or our files, I'm sorry. Now we can access the files that have a folder ID equal to this folder ID and the user ID equal to our current user ID. And again, we're going to order that by created at, and we want to set our child files. And here our thing is going to be child files. And then way all the way up here at the top, we need to create another action for our child files. So child files is going to be setting our child files to our payload.child files. Then up here, we need set child files. And that's just going to allow us to update the files themselves and the folders. Now we have an action for folders and files. And down here, our action is essentially saying every single time that our folder ID or our current user changes, get the new files. So now here, we should have our child files accessible, and we can actually render them out to the screen inside of our dashboard component. So if we go to our dashboard, we can do a very similar thing we did with our child folders, but we can do it for our child files. Let's just copy this, paste it down. We wanted to do this for our child files. And here, child files, and we want to get that variable from here, child files. And we can just say child file.id, and we want to render a component called file. Also, I want to see if we have child folders, if it's greater than 0, if I spell it correctly as well. So if we have folders and we have child files, so if their length is also greater than 0, then I just want to render out, in a simple HR component. That's just going to give us a nice separator between our folders and our files. So if we have both folders and files on our screen, it'll give us a line separating them. That's only going to happen if we have child folders and child files. Now the next step is obviously going to be creating that file component, and this is luckily a really simple component. So we can say file.js rfc to generate that, and this is going to take in a file. All we need to do in here is render a simple anchor tag. We want this anchor tag to have an href that points to our file URL, and the target is going to be underscore blank. And the reason for that is we want it to open in a brand new tab. Also, we're going to have a class name here, which is button. We want to have it be button outline dark, and we want to have the text truncate and the WB100. Again, just so if we have really long file names, they'll disappear. In here, we want our file.name, and of course, we're going to use font awesome, and that's because we want to have a file icon. So we'll do fa file. There we go. Close that off and give it a class of mr2 just to give it a little spacing from our text itself. So now if we refresh this, we're still getting that error because we need to import file in here. So this should be file file. And now you can see that if we go to something that has a file inside of it, for example, our root should have files inside of it, they should be rendered inside of here, but it's not being rendered. So let's just make sure we inspect to see if we have any errors. And of course it says error in snapshot listener. The query requires an index. You can create it here. We need to create that index. And that's just because we're ordering by created at. So let's just click create here. And again, that's going to take a little while to run. So while that's running, just to test to see if this works, let's get rid of that order that we're using on our child files and go back to here. And we should hopefully have our files being rendered. And of course, cannot read property URL of undefined. And that is occurring inside of here where it's saying our file.url is undefined. So the file we're passing is not correct. So if we go to our dashboard, let's make sure we're passing our file. And of course, this should say file instead of folder. That should fix our problem. And there we go, it does. So now we have access to our file. We click it and it opens it in a new tab. We go into this. We now have a file here and we can open this in a new tab. So we can access our files and our folders. Now, really the final thing left is in our add file button, we need to handle these different sections to be able to show people a progress bar in the bottom right, determining how far the upload has progressed. Because if they upload a lot of files or a really large file, we want to be able to show them that there's progress happening. So what we can do is create a simple state. So let's just import use state. And in this state, I want to track all the files that are currently being uploaded. So we'll say uploading files, set uploading files. This is going to be equal to use state. And by default, this is just an empty array because we don't have any files being uploaded to begin with. Now what happens is when I start an upload, I want to add a file to this. So when I start an upload, I'm going to set uploading files. Based on my previous uploading files, I want to return an array here that has all of my previous files. And I want to add in a brand new file, which has an ID that we're going to generate. It's going to have a name, which is the file.name. It's going to have progress, which is going to start at 0%, and an error, which is going to be false because it's not erroring out. So to generate this ID, we're going to use UUID for that. So we can just say const ID equals UUID v4, run that as a function. And we need to make sure we npm I UUID in order to get this library imported. And then up here, we can say import v4 as UUID v4. We want to import that from UUID. So this should give us that UUID library, which just allows us to generate unique identifiers. Now, if we save that, hopefully this will add the file to this uploading files whenever we start the upload process. To determine if this is working or not, let's actually create a thing that renders out all the files we're uploading. We'll do that down here. Let's wrap this in a fragment. And then down here, we're going to render out all the files that are currently being uploaded. So to do that, first, let's see if we have any files being uploaded. Uploading files.length is greater than 0. Then we need to run some code. In this code, I want to actually use React DOM.create portal. We need to make sure we import React DOM up here. So import React DOM from React DOM, just like that. And essentially, a portal allows us to create code that is going to be rendered somewhere else than inside the current component. If you're unfamiliar with portals, I have a video on them that I'm going to link up in the cards and description down below. But essentially, this portal, we want to create an element inside of it, and this element is a div, which is going to have a bunch of custom styles. These custom styles are going to be for positioning it, absolutely. So we say our position is absolute. We have a bottom of 1 rem, because we want this to be in the bottom. And we also want it to be on the right, so we're going to use 1 rem on the right as well. And we're going to set a max width of 250 pixels, just so it doesn't take up the entirety of our screen. Then we can close off that div, and inside of it is where all of our code is going to go for each one of our individual files that we're uploading. We want to map through each one of our files, and we want to render out some code. And then finally, way down here for our React DOM create portal, it takes a second property, and this second property is where we want to render the portal. In our use case, I just want this portal to be on the document.body, so we're just going to pass that in. That's where our portal is going to get rendered out. Now for our uploading files, we're going to use something called a toast message, and we're going to be importing that from Bootstrap. So if we come up here, just make sure that we import toast from React-Bootstrap, just like that. Also, this up here should say React DOM, just like that, because that's how we spelled it all the way down here. Now we have our toast, and of course we need it to have a key, which is our file.id. Inside of our toast, we're going to have a header. So we say toast.header, and inside of this header, all we need to do is put our file.name, and we're going to put a few little styles on here. So we'll say class name equals text-truncate W100 and D block. That's just so if our text is too long, it'll truncate itself. Next, we need our body of our toast. Inside of here, we're going to use a progress bar from Bootstrap. So progress bar, make sure we import that properly from React Bootstrap, just like that. And down here, inside of our progress bar, we're going to have quite a bit of code. We want inside of here, our progress bar to have a variant. And this variant is going to be determining if the file is errored or not. So if it's an error, then we want this to be danger. Otherwise, we want it to say primary, so it'll be blue. Also, animated is only going to be true if it's not an error. So if we don't have an error, I want the progress bar to be this nice, cool animated look. The now property determines where at in the progress bar we are between 0 and 100. So this is going to be set based on the error as well. If we have an error, then obviously we want the progress bar to be full 100% to show that we have an error. Otherwise, we're going to get the progress that we have and multiply it by 100, because this is going to be a decimal between 0 and 1. Multiply it by 100 will give us a value between 0 and 1. And finally, we want the label of our progress bar. If we have an error, we want this label to say error. Make sure we capitalize it. Otherwise, we want this to essentially be the current progress that we're at. So to do that, we just want to say math.round our file.progress times 100. And then we put the percent symbol at the end. We're going to take our number between 0 and 100. We want to multiply it by 100. That's going to give us a percentage between 0 and 100. So we have between 0 and 1, multiply it by 100, we get a number between 0 and 1. We round it off so we get rid of all the extra decimals and throw the percent on the end. So now that's pretty much all of the code we need to render out our individual uploading files. So if we try to upload a file, let's just come in here and upload a random file. You can see our message pops up down here and our progress bar is at 0. And that's because we're not uploading our progress bar at all. Also, we have this close button. We don't really want this close button unless the actual thing had an error. So in our header, let's just say close button is only accessible if our file was an error. So now, hopefully, if we try to upload something like bridge, we don't have that close button anymore, only if we actually have an error in our file. Now, if we go up here a ways, remember when I said this snapshot runs all the time and tells us the progress of our upload? Well, we can get that progress by taking our snapshot .bytes transferred and dividing it by the total amount of bytes that it has to transfer. So snapshot.total bytes, this is how many bytes we have to transfer, and this is how many we have transferred so far. This will give us a percentage, and then we can take our uploading files and we can set them to a new value. And in here we just say return previous uploading files. We want to map them. So for each upload file, I want to determine if the upload file.id is equal to the ID we generated way up here. There it is. So if we're on the current same ID, then I want to return essentially the exact same file, but I want to update the progress to be based on the progress of this bar right here. And then otherwise, way down here, I just want to return the upload file if it doesn't match the current ID. So now hopefully we should see the progress bar update itself when we upload a file. So click on here and you can see the progress bar steadily increasing and the percentage inside of it. And once it reaches 100%, it shows up right here. And once it reaches that 100%, we obviously want to remove it. So in here, this is what happens when it reaches 100%. We want to remove it. So we can do the exact same thing, set uploading files, previous uploading files. And what we want to do is just take our previous uploading files. We want to filter them. And all we want to do is take it where our upload file is not equal to the current ID. So if the upload file.id is not equal to the current ID, then save it, otherwise remove it. So now we're of course getting an error. That's just because we need to return here. And now what we can do is if we upload, hopefully as soon as it reaches 100%, it'll clear itself out. So 100%, boom, it disappears. In here is where we handle errors. So I just want to set our uploading files based on our previous uploading files. And I want to return our previous uploading files.map. This is going to look very similar to the function above it. So for our upload file, if I spell that correctly, if the upload file.id is equal to our current ID, then return our object where we spread out our current upload file. And I want to set error to true. Otherwise, we can just return our upload file. So if we have an error in the upload process, it'll set this error here to true. Now, in order to actually simulate an error, what I want to do is just take our error code, copy it down here, and comment out this code for now. So this is going to simulate what happens if there's an error, so we can kind of test it. As soon as our code reaches 100%, it'll look as if it was errored out, even though it technically succeeded. So now this is what it looks like when we have an error. You can see we have this close button, but right now clicking it does nothing, so we'll need to hook that up. And also you can see it says error instead of the percentage, and it still has the name and it has this red color. So to make that close button work, we need to come to our toast here. We need to set up an onClose handler. And this onClose handler is going to be pretty straightforward. There's going to be a function, and in here we're going to set our uploading files. And we just want to remove our file. So we're going to say previous uploading files, return our previous uploading files dot filter. We want to filter on the file that doesn't match the correct ID. So upload file.id is not equal to the file.id. If it doesn't equal the current file, then don't remove it, otherwise remove it. Now what happens is if we simulate that error, again by uploading bridge.jpg, wait for it to finish loading up here, and then this X button will allow us to clear that out, so we can clear out any of those errors. Let's just come up here, get this code back where it belongs, and let's make sure that we just delete this because it's already up here. So now hopefully, let's just upload again to make sure this is working, upload bridge, and it could go all the way to 100%, and then boom, it's right there. You're going to notice something really interesting though. We have like 8 bridge files right here. Even though all these bridge files are exactly the same, they have the exact same name, they're in the exact same location, they should be overwriting each other. Because if you add a file with the same name to the same folder, it'll overwrite itself. We want to build that functionality in. So here, instead of always adding a file, we first want to check to see if it exists. So we'll say database.files. And we want to get it where, where the name is the same. So if the name equals the file.name, and if the user ID is the same as the current user.id, which is UUID, if that's the same, and if the folder ID is the same on the current folder.id, if all of these are the same and we're able to actually get something, then we want to do an update instead of a create. So we're going to do a .get, which is asynchronous. So we have .then, and this is going to give us our existing files. And if we have an existing file, which is just going to be the first element in our array, so existing file equals existing files of the first one. So if we have an existing file, we're going to get that from the docs, then what we want to do is update that. So if existing file, then we want to take the existing file .ref, we want to update it, and we want to update just the URL. So we're going to say URL is equal to our new URL. We're updating the URL to be the new URL of the file we uploaded. Otherwise, what I want to do is add it since we don't currently have one. So we're just going to take our add code and paste it into there. So now if we upload a file with the exact same name, it should hopefully update the existing file instead of adding a new one. In order to make sure this is working, we just need to delete a bunch of these files that we currently have added. So I just want to come in here. I'm just going to delete pretty much all the files that we have one by one. So delete that one. Let's delete this one. And the reason I'm doing this is just so that we don't have any of those weird duplicates. Let's just delete all the files that we have inside of our database one by one here. Luckily, we don't have too many to delete. And the reason I'm not deleting the entire collection is because I already have the index set up on the collection and I don't want to regenerate that index because like I said, it's pretty slow. Now we have all of those deleted. And what I want to do is just minimize this down a little bit. We'll go over to our Firebase storage and I want to delete all of our files in here. So that way our database is as clean as possible. Everything is deleted and back to normal. So now what we can do is go back into our Cloud Firestore. We have no files at all, which is great. Next thing that I want to do is just add one. So we'll add one at the root here of bridge.jpg. It's going to load up. As soon as it finishes loading, we should see it appear right here. And if we refresh over here, we should see that we have that file right here. Now what we can do is re-add that file a second time. So we'll add bridge.jpg again. Let's make sure I actually click on that properly. Bridge.jpg. And it looks like it's not doing anything, so there must be an error. Let's inspect. You can see using target blank, that's fine, that doesn't matter. We're not actually getting an error. Let's see if we can still upload like trees.jpg. That's working just fine. Now let's go back, try to re-upload that bridge one. Okay, now it's working again. So let's wait for that to go all the way through. And you'll notice it doesn't actually create a new element in here. It just updates the one that currently exists. Because as you can see, we only have 2 files here, and we can just click on them and open them up just fine. But now we're getting a permission denied. And the reason for that is interesting. If we inspect, you're going to notice we're going to get an error for Firebase insufficient permissions. The reason for this is that if we go over to Firebase and look at our rules, we only have rules for reading and creating. We don't actually have any update rules. So it didn't update our file with the correct URL. We need to make sure we write in an update rule. Now this update rule is going to be really straightforward. We're going to say allow update if we're authenticated. So if we're auth, and we want to make sure that we match the user. So we'll say matches user from the resource.data. And then finally, we want to have another check to make sure we're not updating the user ID field. We'll say user ID, because if we're updating the user ID, that's really, really bad. So what we can do here is say function not updating, and we want to take in a field. The first thing we want to do is we want to just see if this field is even passed up. So if this field is not in the request.resource.data, then that's fine. We're not updating it. Next, we need to check to see if the resource.data of that field is equal to the request.resource.data of that field. So essentially we're saying, did we even pass up the field? That's what this first check does. If we didn't pass the field, that's fine. It's not being updated. If we did pass the field though, then we're checking to see if the data from our current resource is the same as the field that we're passing up. And again, if so, we didn't update it. So now what we can do is go back in here. We can upload like trees, for example. It's going to go through just fine. And when we click this, it actually updated our URL, which is why we're able to open it. And bridge still is broken, but if I update bridge again, you can see that the progress bar is going to climb all the way up. And when I click bridge JPEG, it now works. And that right there is all it takes to create this Google Drive clone. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out my other project-based videos linked over here and subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this. Thank you very much for watching and have a good day.